On a morning in late October of 1999, 48-year-old Bruce Miller grabbed his car keys off the kitchen counter, quickly devoured a piece of toast, and then headed into the living room of his ranch-style home in the small town of Clio, Michigan. Bruce was over 6 feet tall and lanky, with graying hair and a mustache. He wore a button-up shirt, jeans, and work boots. Bruce walked towards the front door as his 28-year-old wife, Cherie, rushed into the room from the hallway. Cherie was short with dyed blonde hair and light eyes. Mornings were always a bit crazy in the Miller household. Cherie had 2 young children from a previous marriage, and so she had to get them ready for school, and Bruce was always in a hurry to get to the business that he owned. Bruce leaned down and kissed his wife, and Cherie's face lit up. But when she got a good look at Bruce's shirt, her face completely changed. Cherie reached up to the front pocket on Bruce's shirt, and she pulled out a huge wad of cash. Then she held the money up in front of Bruce and gave him a look like, "I can't believe what you're doing." Everyone who knew Bruce knew he always carried a whole bunch of cash right in his front shirt pocket. Bruce said it was to make change for customers at work, but Cherie and others told him he was crazy to have that much cash just out in the open like that. It was like you're inviting getting robbed, and Cherie really wanted him to stop doing it. But Bruce smiled and took the money back from Cherie and slipped it right back into his shirt pocket. He told her he'd be fine, he kissed her again, and then walked outside into the cool fall air. Bruce could see the bright yellows and reds in the changing leaves on the trees, and so he knew the cold Michigan winter would be arriving soon. But for now, Bruce was enjoying the pleasant fall weather, and he felt like today was a perfect day to work outside. Bruce got into his car and drove a few minutes down the road to the outskirts of town. There, he turned off the main road onto a dirt road and drove for a couple more minutes until he finally arrived at the B&D salvage yard. Bruce drove through an open gate into the yard and parked his car in front of the small, one-story white building that served as the salvage yard's office. Bruce hopped out of his car and surveyed the yard. Abandoned vehicles and stray auto parts stretched out in heaps and rows for acres. Bruce smiled. He never felt more at home than when he was right there. Bruce loved everything about cars. He loved watching NASCAR races, he loved driving, but most of all, he loved working on cars that other people thought were beyond repair. And so Bruce had always felt like having a salvage yard would be like having a personal playground. And so that was actually why, years earlier, he and a business partner had gone ahead and bought this salvage yard. But Bruce didn't just see this yard as a place for him to have fun and work on old beat-up cars. Instead, he saw it as the key to his and Cherie's future. Bruce had spent the last 30 years of his life, since he was about 18 years old, working for General Motors, or GM. At the time, GM was the top-selling automotive manufacturer in the entire United States, and it was one of the largest employers in the state of Michigan. In the 3 decades that Bruce had worked there, he'd held a range of different positions, and he had done really well. Bruce had loved working for GM from the time he started as a teen. It allowed him to be around cars all the time, and it had given him a chance to save a good amount of money. But after 30 years on the job, Bruce was ready to start a new phase of his life, and so that was where the salvage yard came in. Bruce had already reduced his time at GM, but he planned to walk away entirely within the year. And so at that point, the salvage yard would have to become his primary revenue stream. But Bruce was optimistic because historically, people from all across the area flocked to the B&D salvage yard to get good deals on used automotive parts or to just buy old cars and trucks that they wanted to try to fix up themselves. Standing outside his office, Bruce gazed out over the piles of metal that looked like they went on forever. He knew a lot of people saw this yard as nothing more than a dump, a place that was filled with junk that had no use. But Bruce saw potential in that junk. He knew that with hard work and a little care, almost any car part could be made as good as new. And in some ways, Bruce felt like he owed his entire life to the discarded car parts on that lot. Because when he had bought the salvage yard, it ended up giving him way more than just a potential retirement plan. Years earlier, when he'd just become the new owner of the yard, Bruce had gone to the office to meet his employees, and the young, blonde bombshell who took care of the financial books for the salvage yard almost stopped him in his tracks. Her name was Cherie, and Bruce could just not stop staring at her. So, not long after that day in the office, he had asked Cherie out. And as he had gotten to know Cherie more, he had fallen in love with every aspect of her, not just her looks. Cherie was kind and caring in a way that Bruce just wasn't used to. He had actually been married 3 times before, and he always felt like his ex-wives had been purposely cruel to him. But Cherie was different. She spent her time when she wasn't working just trying to help people. She took care of her 2 young kids, she had worked for years at a local retirement community, and she did everything she could to advocate for victims of child abuse. Cherie had witnessed child abuse at different periods of her life, and she felt compelled to stand up for kids who could not stand up for themselves. And it was her dream to someday make or raise enough money to start a nonprofit organization that was dedicated to helping victims of child abuse across the country. When Bruce and Cherie had really begun dating, it became clear pretty quickly that they both wanted to spend the rest of their lives together. So, earlier that year, in 1999, they had gotten married. And Bruce had begun to see the salvage yard as an opportunity for Cherie to realize her dream of starting her own nonprofit. So, not long after the wedding, Bruce and Cherie had bought out Bruce's business partner and taken over full ownership of the salvage yard themselves. They hoped the money they would make from the yard would allow Bruce to fully walk away from GM and enable Cherie to become a full-time advocate. Bruce took in one more breath of fresh air and then walked inside the office. Inside, it looked like the place had not been updated or even really cleaned in years. There were stained walls and boxes and supplies and files sticking out all over the place, and there were all these beat-up metal tables with ashtrays on them that were overflowing with cigarette butts. But it still felt like Bruce's happy place. Bruce said hello to the woman who now handled the financial books for him, but he could tell she was upset about something. Bruce asked her what was wrong, and she said when she was going over recent sales, she was sure that some auto parts, including some tires, had disappeared without being paid for. Bruce shook his head. Despite keeping the yard gated and locked when nobody was there, theft was often just part of this business. But Bruce was angry, because he was sure he knew who had taken off with the parts in question. So Bruce walked to the cluttered front counter, sat down in a swivel chair, picked up the phone, and called a man named John Hutchinson. John had been an employee at the salvage yard when Bruce first took over, and almost right from the start, the 2 men had clashed. At first, Bruce didn't understand what John's problem was. After all, Bruce was a pretty laid-back guy who did his best to get along with everyone, but eventually, Cherie had told Bruce that she knew why John didn't like him. Cherie and John had once dated. And even though Cherie had broken things off, she believed John still had a thing for her, and so he was jealous when she and Bruce had started dating. Even with that news, Bruce still tried to get along with John. He felt like it wasn't right to just get rid of John simply because at one point he had dated Cherie. But after a short time of working together, John had basically given Bruce no choice. The 2 men just kept clashing at work, and then Bruce discovered that John was selling parts from the yard to his friends and family for way below asking price. And then John had just begun outright stealing things from the yard. So Bruce had fired John. But the stealing didn't stop. John knew every way in and out of the salvage yard, and even though Bruce couldn't prove it, he was pretty sure John was still ripping him off. Bruce clutched the phone tight when he heard John's voice on the other line. And within a few seconds, the 2 men were screaming at each other on the phone. Bruce accused John of stealing, and John denied that he had done anything, and he attacked Bruce for firing him out of sheer jealousy. Finally, Bruce slammed the phone down and took a deep breath. Then he walked outside, made his way through the salvage yard, and began to look for a car to work on to take his mind off the fight he'd just gotten into. And after spending a large chunk of his day outside in the beautiful fall weather working on cars, Bruce did feel a lot better. So by the time Bruce got home that night and had dinner with Cherie and her 2 young kids, he was able to stay calm when he told Cherie about the phone call he'd had with John. Cherie said she was sorry he had to deal with that she couldn't help but feel a bit responsible for the trouble John continued to cause her husband. But Bruce told her, don't worry, it was not her fault at all. Later that night, after Cherie and Bruce got the kids to bed, Cherie suddenly had this huge smile come across her face, and before Bruce could ask her why she was so happy, she just grabbed his hand and led him into their small home office. There, Cherie went to the computer on the old wooden desk and turned it on and waited for the dial-up internet to connect. Then, after it connected, Cherie, still with her huge grin on her face, pulled up an internet chat room and pointed at the screen for Bruce to see. Back in 1999, the internet was really just starting to take hold in the United States, and more people than ever before were connecting with each other online. mostly through instant messaging services and also through chat rooms where people could meet others who shared the same interests. Being 20 years younger than her husband, Cherie had grown up loving video games, she'd gotten into computers as soon as they became common in households across the US, and now she loved the internet. And recently, Cherie had found a number of chat rooms where she said she could talk to people from all over the country and maybe even all over the world who were also advocates for victims of child abuse. And so that was what she was pointing at on the screen, was one of those chat rooms. Cherie told John that she believed the internet and her ability to connect with these other people would make it a lot easier for her to learn the best ways to establish and run the advocacy group she had dreamed about starting. Bruce looked at the screen and then smiled, hugged Cherie, and gave her a kiss. He didn't really understand the point of the internet or chat rooms, but Cherie knew way more about it than he did, so if she believed the internet could be an effective tool, then he was happy for her. That night, as they lay in bed, Bruce and Cherie talked about how they felt like their future plans were really starting to fall into place. Bruce was sure he'd be able to make the salvage yard his only job soon, and Cherie would get to help more children on a much larger scale. They just had to keep working hard and being patient, and eventually everything would work out just like they had planned. On the afternoon of Monday, November 8th, 1999, so a couple of weeks after Bruce and John had fought on the phone, Bruce headed out to the salvage yard. He was exhausted because he'd worked a late shift at General Motors the night before, but he still wanted to go into the yard to check on business and to spend some time working on an old car. Bruce drove through the gate and parked his car in front of the office. He stepped outside, breathed in the fresh air, and immediately began to feel a bit more awake. Then he walked into the office and saw his wife sitting behind the front counter. Cherie smiled, stood up, walked around the counter, and gave her husband a big kiss. She had opened up the salvage yard that morning after she dropped off the kids at school. That way Bruce could get some extra sleep after his late night at GM the night before. Cherie said it had been a pretty quiet day so far. Then she told Bruce she'd see him later at home. After Cherie was gone, Bruce checked in with the one other employee who was in the office, and then Bruce went to the yard to spend the rest of the day working outside. A little after 5 p.m., so just as the sun was setting below the horizon, Bruce decided it was time to head back inside the office to get some paperwork done before he went home. When he went in there, the one employee was still inside, and so Bruce told them they could head home and that Bruce would stick around and close up the yard on his own. And so after the employee thanked him and left, Bruce sat down in his old metal swivel chair and began digging through a stack of papers on the front counter, looking for a few forms that he needed to sign. About an hour later, at 6 p.m., Bruce was still inside the office doing paperwork when the office phone rang. Bruce answered, and he heard his wife's voice on the other line. She told him that the kids really wanted pizza from their favorite restaurant for dinner that night, and so she would call the order in if he could just pick it up on the way home. Bruce said that sounded great and that he would, and that he'd close up shop in just a few minutes. Cherie told Bruce she loved him, and they both hung up. Bruce pulled out a cigarette and lit it, and then exhaled a puff of smoke, and then glanced back down at the paperwork on his desk to make sure he'd finished everything he wanted to. But as he was doing this, suddenly the front door to the office swung open, someone stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind them. A little after 8 p.m., so 2 hours after Cherie had talked to Bruce on the phone about pizza, she paced around her living room. The kids were sitting in the kitchen, still waiting for pizza, and Bruce had still not arrived home. Cherie went to the kitchen, grabbed the phone, and called the salvage yard. She told the kids that Bruce must have been delayed with a last-minute customer, but as she sat there, the phone just kept on ringing and nobody picked up. So eventually, Cherie hung up, called Bruce's brother, and asked if he had heard from Bruce. The two brothers talked all the time, especially about football, and Cherie knew there was a big Monday night football game on. But Bruce's brother surprisingly said they actually had not spoken at all that day. But Bruce's brother could tell Cherie sounded very worried, so he tried to calm her down. He said Bruce was most likely somewhere between the salvage yard and the pizza place, or maybe he had already gotten the pizza and he was on his way home. But either way, he was probably just fine. And so after that, they hung up. But Cherie did not feel any calmer. So she grabbed the kids, put them in her car, and drove to the pizza place. But she didn't pass Bruce on the way, and when she got to the restaurant, they told her that Bruce had never come in to pick up the order. Cherie grabbed the pizza and then raced back home with the kids and immediately called her brother-in-law again. And this time, when he heard Cherie's voice, he could tell she was far more anxious, and he admitted to her after hearing what had just happened that this did seem pretty strange. So he told Cherie that he and his wife would go right now over to the salvage yard to just check on things. A few minutes after that phone call, Bruce's brother and his wife drove through the open gate at the salvage yard, and right away they spotted Bruce's car still parked out in front of the office. Now, the sight of his car made Bruce's brother actually feel better. He figured Bruce must have gotten caught up with work, and he must have just been on the phone with somebody else when Cherie had tried calling him. Bruce's brother and his wife stepped out of their car and walked up to the office door, and right away they froze. Because when they looked down, they could see the front door to the office was actually cracked open a bit, and they knew Bruce never left this door open when he was working alone at night because of all the theft. And so this was a big red flag. Bruce's brother and his wife began calling out Bruce's name through this gap in the door, but nobody answered from inside. So the couple nodded to each other and then pushed the door open and stepped into the office, and right away they saw a huge pile of cigarette butts on the floor in front of the counter. Then they walked around the counter and looked down at the floor, and when they did, they just stood there in total shock. Bruce was sprawled out on the floor in a thick pool of blood. Bruce's brother instinctively dropped down to try to revive Bruce, but he already knew Bruce was dead. Bruce's sister-in-law's hands started shaking uncontrollably, but she still managed to grab the phone on the front counter and dial 911. About an hour after the 911 call, Detective Sergeant Ives Petrovka of the Genesee County Sheriff's Department drove down a dirt road towards the salvage yard. And as Petrovka got closer, he began to look around and think to himself that the salvage yard at night seemed kind of menacing. These huge piles of metal rising up into the sky, creating paths and hidden corners everywhere that made it impossible for somebody there to ever really know if they were actually alone. Petrovka drove through the open gate and parked his car near the front office, where a local police cruiser with flashing lights was already parked near several other state police vehicles. Petrovka stepped out of the car and saw fellow Sheriff's Department detective Kevin Shanlian pull into the lot behind him. Petrovka's tie was hanging loose, and he always looked like he was in a hurry. In contrast, Shanlian was very calm and was the kind of person who never had a hair out of place. But despite their huge differences, the two detectives got along well. In the parking lot, Petrovka and Shanlian walked over to the first officer who had arrived at the scene. The officer was standing outside of the office with Bruce's sister-in-law and his brother, who both still looked like they were in shock. Petrovka introduced himself and said he was sorry to ask them to stay longer, but he would probably need to ask them some questions shortly. Bruce's brother nodded blankly and said that he and his wife would stick around to help. Then Petrovka and Shanlian walked into the office. The cramped office felt like it was totally packed with people, even though there were only a few members of the State Crime Lab forensics team inside. The county detectives introduced themselves, and a woman from the crime lab who had short hair and a quiet voice motioned for them to join her on the other side of the front counter. Petrovka and Shanlian took a few steps across the office, avoiding the pile of cigarette butts on the floor, and walked around the counter. There, they saw Bruce's body, and by Bruce's head was another pile of cigarette butts. The forensics officer was crouched down over Bruce's body. She was using pieces of one-sided tape to pull potential hair samples from Bruce's shirt. But Petrovka barely noticed what she was doing because he was stunned by the amount of blood covering Bruce's chest, the floor, and the wall behind Bruce's body. Even at first glance, it was clear to the detectives that Bruce had been shot at close range with a powerful weapon, most likely a shotgun. But no expended shells had been found at the scene. The forensics officers cataloged and stored hair samples from Bruce's shirt, and then the woman with the quiet voice motioned for the detectives to follow her back to the front door. They walked around the counter, and then the woman told them to take a look at the office from where they were standing. And then when they began doing this, she asked them if anything jumped out at them. The one thing that really jumped out at Detective Petrovka was what a mess the place was. There were papers overflowing from boxes, there were ashtrays that looked like they hadn't been emptied in weeks scattered all across these small tables, and grease and oil stains all over the floor. The forensics officer said Petrovka was exactly right. The place was a complete mess, which is why she was surprised that they hadn't found any fingerprints or physical evidence on the front door where the killer would have had to enter and exit. And she said what was even stranger was that they had not found any footprints in the grease and oil stains on the floor. Normally, those types of stains were very effective at capturing prints. And so Petrovka and Shanlian assumed, based on this information, that whoever had killed Bruce must have taken time to really wipe the place down afterwards. The forensics officer said that would explain the door being totally clear of prints, but she didn't find any evidence that the floor had been cleaned. Instead, she thought whoever had killed Bruce had known where the grease stains were on the floor, and so they had just avoided stepping in them. Petrovka glanced over at Shanlian with a very knowing look on his face. They both knew if that theory checked out, that somebody knew where these stains were, then that meant they were very likely looking for someone who knew Bruce and who was familiar with this office. So the detectives stepped outside to talk to the people who had found Bruce's body, his brother and his sister-in-law. Outside in the salvage yard, Bruce's brother saw the detectives walking his way, and so he tried to pull himself together. Since finding his brother dead inside of the office, Bruce's brother and his wife had pretty much just been in shock and had barely even spoken to each other. But when Petrovka asked Bruce's brother why they had been at the salvage yard in the first place, he told the detective that Bruce's wife, Cherie, had called him twice in a panic because Bruce had not come home from work. So he and his wife said they would go check out the salvage yard to see what was going on, and that's when they found Bruce's body. As he spoke, Bruce's brother choked back tears. He told the detectives that he'd already called his mother to tell her that Bruce was dead, but that he couldn't bring himself to say what had happened to him. So he just told her that they thought Bruce might have had a heart attack. After speaking with Bruce's brother and sister-in-law for several minutes, Petrovka and Shanlian felt like these two witnesses were telling the truth. It was way too early to actually rule anyone or anything out, but the detectives felt like they'd learned everything they could from Bruce's brother and his wife for the time being. And so now the detectives wanted to talk to Bruce's wife, Cherie, to see if she had any information that could help. The detectives thanked Bruce's brother and his wife for coming and talking to them, and then the detectives got into their cars and headed towards town. It was well after midnight on November 9th, so several hours after Bruce's body had been discovered, when Petrovka and Shanlian stepped inside of Bruce and Cherie's house. The detectives stood in the living room, and Cherie sat on the couch. Her face was pale, almost gray, and she looked totally lost. Cherie had heard about what happened to Bruce from her mother-in-law, and then also a uniformed police officer had come by her house to confirm the news. But neither of them had told Cherie what actually happened. All they told her was that her husband was dead. However, now, the two detectives told Cherie what they actually found at the crime scene. And Cherie would tell them that she had been terribly worried about her husband when he didn't come home, but she never imagined anything as horrible as what they had just told her. Petrovka leaned down in front of Cherie and told her how sorry he was for her loss, and he was sorry that she had not been informed properly about what happened. Then suddenly, Cherie looked right at Petrovka, and she seemed way more alert than she had since the detectives got there. And she asked Petrovka if they had found a large amount of cash in Bruce's shirt pocket. Petrovka said they had not found any money, at which point Cherie explained that her husband always had like a couple of $1,000s in cash in that front pocket. Petrovka asked if anybody else knew this, and Cherie nodded vigorously. She said most of Bruce's friends and family knew about his habit of carrying around a whole bunch of money, and anybody who worked at the salvage yard would also know that too. The detectives shared a quick glance. The evidence the forensics officers had found made them pretty sure whoever had killed Bruce knew him and knew the layout of the salvage yard office. So Petrovka asked Cherie if she could think of anyone who knew Bruce who also might have had it out for him or who might have just wanted to rob him. Cherie closed her eyes and thought for a second, and then she looked back up at Petrovka and told him there actually was one man who could not stand her husband. He was a former employee at the salvage yard who actually she had once dated, and she said his name was John Hutchinson, and he had a history of stealing from her husband. Petrovka thanked Cherie for her help and told her again how sorry he was for her loss. Then he and Shanlian headed outside to their cars. Back at the sheriff's station, the two detectives talked about what Cherie had told them, and they agreed that this John Hutchinson guy seemed to fit the description of who they were looking for. Someone who knew Bruce, who knew the salvage yard, and who literally had a history of stealing from Bruce before. And so certainly this guy John would also know that Bruce carried thousands of dollars in cash on his person. So by the time the sun started to rise that morning, the detectives believed they had identified their very first major suspect. At 1:30 p.m. on November 9th, the day after Bruce's murder, Detective Shanlian led John Hutchinson into a small interrogation room at the sheriff's station. John was tall with a square jaw, a shaved head, and piercing eyes. People who knew him said he was good-looking enough to be a Hollywood star. Shanlian motioned for John to take a seat at a small table in the center of the room, and Shanlian then sat down across from him. The room was warm, and John was already sweating, but Shanlian figured that might have more to do with nerves than with the room's temperature. Shanlian was very calm, and he had an ability to put people at ease really quickly, which is why he'd been chosen to conduct this interview. Shanlian said he knew John was nervous, and that was totally normal. Shanlian said he was not going to try to trick John or get him to say anything that wasn't true. He just needed John to answer a few simple questions. John nodded and said he wanted to help. During the course of the interview, Shanlian got John to talk about his past relationship with Cherie, and he even got him to admit that he had, in fact, stolen auto parts from the salvage yard before. But John also said that he had owed Bruce money. When Shanlian heard that, he barely reacted, but inside, he thought that information made John an even more likely suspect. Then, Shanlian asked John if he owned any weapons. John said he was a hunter, so yes, he had several rifles and a shotgun. Now, at this point, Shanlian knew Bruce had been killed with a shotgun, so he leaned forward and started to press John a little bit harder. He asked a series of rapid-fire questions, keeping the focus on John's past with Cherie and his strained relationship with Bruce. But John kept insisting that, whatever issues he'd had with Bruce, none of them would have led John to kill Bruce. He even said that Bruce had always been pretty cool to him, and that he himself was probably to blame for the tension between them. Then, without prompting from Shanlian, John stood up and said, "Hey, can I take a lie detector test?" He'd seen on TV and movies that a lie detector test could prove he was innocent. Shanlian said he would have to make a quick call first, but he was pretty sure they could schedule a polygraph test for John that day. So John sat back down and said the test would make it clear he really did have nothing to do with Bruce's murder. At this point, Shanlian nodded, got up, and walked out of the room. But he didn't leave to go set up the polygraph test just yet. Instead, he joined the other members of the investigative team behind a two-way mirror that looked into the interrogation room where John was. And when Shanlian looked through that mirror, he saw something that totally threw him for a loop. John was sitting in the interrogation room alone, and then suddenly he just bent over and began sobbing. And the sobbing didn't stop, and it went on for so long that eventually Shanlian and the others decided that this guy must be having a total breakdown. Finally, after several minutes, it seemed like John was beginning to calm down, and so Shanlian stepped away from the mirror and went and scheduled the polygraph test, and then he returned to the mirror looking back into the interrogation room. By this point, John had managed to calm himself down a bit, but it was clear he just could not stop crying. Shanlian and the others had no idea if this guy was just totally racked with guilt over something he had done, or if maybe just the pressure of being in this interrogation room had caused him to kind of snap. A little later that day, John would sit down for his polygraph test, but he would keep changing his answer to every question, and then by the end of the test, it was clear John had just failed. And so Detectives Shanlian and Petrovka became even more convinced that they had found Bruce's killer. On November 13th, 1999, 5 days after Bruce's murder, members of the investigative team stood amongst Bruce's friends and family in a cemetery for Bruce's funeral. Bruce's casket was driven through the cemetery on the back of a flatbed truck, and inside the closed casket, Bruce was dressed in a black Dale Earnhardt jacket. Dale Earnhardt had always been Bruce's favorite NASCAR driver. Everyone there thought the entire funeral was the perfect send-off for a man who had loved cars as much as Bruce. Detectives Petrovka and Shanlian listened as Bruce's brother talked about how happy Bruce had been in the final days of his life. Bruce's business was doing well, and he finally saw a future where he could be his own boss at a place he loved. And Bruce's brother said that after years of searching and many failed marriages, Bruce had finally found the woman of his dreams in Cherie, and that Bruce had really come to love her kids like they were his own. Hearing about how loving Bruce had been to his family and friends really made Petrovka and Shanlian want to bring his killer to justice as soon as they could. They knew nothing would ever bring Bruce back, but his family deserved some kind of closure. And with their main suspect, John Hutchinson, right in their sights, the detectives thought they were very close to actually solving this case. But in the following weeks, Petrovka and Shanlian could not find any evidence that directly linked John to the scene of the murder. Now, they didn't think this proved that John was innocent, really kind of the opposite. They thought this just showed that John really did know how to cover his tracks at the salvage yard. They even brought John in for a second polygraph test, and he failed it again. Still, investigators and the district attorney didn't think they had nearly enough evidence to actually convict John if this case went to court. So, as 1999 came to an end, Bruce's murder remained unsolved. At that time, Detective Petrovka had been training in the relatively new field of computer forensics, an investigative practice that looks at data and evidence from computer devices potentially used in crimes. And Petrovka had proven to be quite good at computer forensics, and he had set his sights on working for state authorities in this new field. But he made it clear to Shanlian and the rest of the investigative team that he was still fully committed to Bruce's case. He wanted to bring Bruce's killer to justice. But as January 2000 passed by with still no more new evidence linking John Hutchinson to the murder, both Petrovka and Shanlian began to worry that maybe they had set their sights on the wrong person. On February 17, 2000, so over 3 months after Bruce's murder, Petrovka was sitting at his desk when he got a call from a police officer in nearby Flint, Michigan. As Petrovka listened to the officer on the other line, he couldn't help but feel really confused. The Flint officer said he'd received a call from an attorney who worked in a small town in Missouri. That attorney had spoken to local law enforcement in that Missouri town, and they had told him that they'd stumbled onto a case that they believed was somehow linked to Bruce Miller's murder in Michigan. And so after this officer explained everything they could to Petrovka, Petrovka hung up the phone feeling pretty excited, but also still feeling pretty confused. How could anything in this random small Missouri town be connected to this Michigan murder case he had been working on for months? But nonetheless, Petrovka pushed forward and contacted the local police department in that Missouri town, as well as the county sheriff's department that had jurisdiction in that area. Then, after talking to both of those departments, Petrovka rushed over to Shanlian's desk and told him they might have a huge break in the Bruce Miller case. Petrovka said he was going to book a flight to Missouri, and he would know more when he got back. The following day, Petrovka was in Missouri, meeting with detectives and sitting in on interviews regarding a suicide that had happened in this small town. And this suicide was the case that police believed was linked to Bruce's murder. And sure enough, by the time Petrovka returned to Michigan a couple of days later, he was absolutely positive he knew who had killed Bruce and how they'd done it. Based on evidence collected from the scene of the suicide in Missouri and the murder scene at the salvage yard, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation into Bruce Miller's death, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened on the night someone murdered Bruce Miller, November 8, 1999. On that day, at around 2 p.m., the killer pulled into a rest stop in Flint, Michigan. The killer stepped out of their car and stretched their legs. They had been driving non-stop for over 10 hours. After stretching, the killer walked across the parking lot to the rest stop payphone. They put a coin in, dialed a number, let it ring once, and then hung up. The killer then stepped away from the phone, walked over to a picnic table, sat down, and waited. The air was cool, and the killer felt relaxed for the first time since they'd started driving earlier that morning. A few minutes later, the killer saw a car pull into the same rest stop parking lot they were in, and they watched as a person got out of that car and walked right towards them. The killer stood, and the person who had just arrived handed them a cell phone. Then the person headed back to their car, and the killer slipped that cell phone into their jeans pocket and then sat back down at the table. After sitting at the rest stop for hours, that cell phone in the killer's pocket began to ring. Killer calmly pulled it out and answered the call. They spoke to the person on the other line, and then afterwards the killer walked to their car. At about 6:45 p.m., almost 5 hours after arriving at that rest stop, the killer cut their headlights off as they drove down the dirt road leading to the salvage yard. They pulled through the open gate and parked their car several yards away from the office. The killer stepped out of the car, walked around to the back, and opened up the trunk. They reached inside and pulled out a shotgun. The killer closed the trunk, and then they marched right up to the front door of the office. They threw it open and slammed it shut behind them. Bruce, who was inside the office, looked up from behind the counter right as the killer raised that shotgun and fired. A deafening bang echoed off the walls inside the office, and the shell from the shotgun struck Bruce right in the throat. Blood and gore spilled and spattered on the floor and walls. The force from the shot actually spun Bruce's metal swivel chair around, and his arm hit an ashtray as he tumbled from the chair to the floor, scattering cigarette butts on both sides of the counter. The killer took a breath and lowered the shotgun. Then they looked down at the floor and took note of several grease stains. Then they stepped around the counter, being very careful to avoid those grease stains. Once the killer had made it around to the back of the counter, they stared down at Bruce, and they were sure he was dead. So the killer reached into their pocket, grabbed that cell phone, and made a call. They let it ring once and then hung up. The killer then slipped the phone back into their pocket, walked to the front door, avoiding the grease stains again, and walked back outside to their car. The killer put the shotgun back in the trunk. Then they got into the driver's seat and began the 10-hour drive back to where they had come from. And as the killer's car headed down the highway into the darkness, the person who had delivered the cell phone to the killer at that rest stop walked into their kitchen, and they told their 2 kids that Bruce, their stepfather, would be home soon with their pizza. Bruce's wife, Cherie, had orchestrated Bruce's murder. It would turn out that Cherie had not been using those online chat rooms to find other people who were advocates for victims of abuse. Instead, she had been visiting chat rooms to play out her sexual fantasies with men from all across the country. And whenever she found a man she liked, she would send them explicit photos of herself online, and she would also literally mail them explicit videotapes of herself because in 1999, most people were not sharing videos online yet. And one man in particular who had met Cherie in one of these chat rooms and who had received photos and videos from her had fallen totally in love with her. He was 39 years old from Missouri, and his name was Jerry Cassidy. After talking for a few weeks via chat rooms and an online direct messaging service, Cherie and Jerry had carried out their digital affair in real life. Cherie had flown to a couple of different cities to meet and have sex with Jerry. And when Cherie was with Jerry, she concocted this far-fetched fantasy life for herself in which her husband, Bruce, was actually this powerful member of an organized crime family who regularly beat her and threatened to kill her. Then, a couple of months before Bruce's murder, Cherie sent a message to Jerry to tell him she was pregnant with Jerry's baby. She even sent him a picture online showing a positive pregnancy test and an ultrasound. But not long after sending those along, Cherie would again message Jerry to tell him that Bruce had beaten her so badly that she had lost their baby. She had used makeup to create bruises all over her body and then sent photos of those bruises to Jerry. And Cherie told Jerry that she would never be safe and they could never be happy together until Bruce was dead. And after seeing these horrible photos of Cherie with all these bruises on her and believing that he and Sherry had just lost their child, Jerry agreed to go kill Bruce. So, via online direct messages, Cherie planned the entire murder with Jerry. She chose the rest stop where they would meet. She bought the cell phone he would use to let her know the job was done. and she was the one to tell Jerry to make sure he didn't step in any of those grease stains on the salvage yard office floor. And so Jerry would carry out the murder, and then afterward, he waited patiently for Cherie to come join him in Missouri. But in the weeks and months following the murder, Cherie started ignoring Jerry, and she eventually told him that she actually didn't want to be with him anymore. Feeling alone, betrayed, and totally riddled with guilt, Jerry took his own life. And so when local police arrived at Jerry's apartment in Missouri after receiving a call from one of his family members, they would find a Bible next to Jerry's body. The Bible was open to a verse in the Gospel of Matthew that read, quote, "Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment," end quote. Then, police also found a videotape in Jerry's trash can, and when they played the tape, they saw a scantily clad Cherie making explicit sexual comments directly to Jerry. That's when Missouri authorities learned about the murder of Cherie's husband in Michigan, at which point they contacted that Flint police officer, who then called Detective Petrovka. After returning from Missouri, Petrovka confiscated Cherie's computer, and using his skills in computer forensics, he was able to uncover the entire murder plot that she had carried out with Jerry online. Cherie was ultimately convicted of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2055. From prison, Cherie would admit her guilt. She said Bruce had been a good man and had never done anything wrong. She said she had just convinced herself that her online life was like a video game and that killing Bruce had become like beating the final level. Some in the media would come to call this case the first murder in the United States that was planned on the internet. This case would alert authorities to the alarming speed at which conspirators could communicate and plan simply by using direct message services and online chat rooms. And so as a result, U.S. law enforcement agencies would greatly increase their investment in the growing field of computer forensics. Alexandra Ignatovic, or Sandra for short, was born in 1967 in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, Canada. Her parents, who had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, were both extremely hardworking people who also had big, warm personalities and great senses of humor. They would pass all three of those qualities on to their daughter, which in turn made her a very popular person from a young age. In addition to her attractive personality, Sandra was also considered very physically attractive, so much so that when she was a teenager, her friends began to encourage her to compete in beauty pageants. Sandra was always flattered by these remarks, but would laugh them off, saying she didn't belong in something like that. But in 1985, during Sandra's senior year of high school, she finally gave in to her friends' suggestions and entered a local beauty contest called the Miss Burnaby pageant. And much to her shock, but not to her friends, she would win. And this win would automatically enter her into the huge Miss Canada beauty competition that year, though she would lose that one. However, Sandra was not remotely fazed by the loss. She actually thought it was pretty funny that she had gotten as far as she had. After high school, Sandra lived at home with her parents and attended a technical school to become a dental assistant. During this time, Sandra and her mom, Zdenka, who she was very close with, developed a hobby that they did together on the weekends. On nice days, they would find local open houses, and they would pretend to be in the market for buying a home, when in reality, they just wanted to walk around the property and fantasize about what it would be like to live there. In 1987, when Sandra was 21 years old and was now working full-time as a dental assistant but still living at home, she and her mother, like usual, went to an open house one weekend in their neighborhood, and once they arrived, it was very crowded, and so they made their way off to the side and just began chatting in their family's native tongue, Serbo-Croatian. And so as they're doing this, a woman they didn't recognize walks up to them. She was this short, older woman with rosy cheeks who was grinning ear to ear, and when she reached the mother and daughter, she very excitedly began speaking in Serbo-Croatian as well. She said her name was Jelka Pesek, and she couldn't help but overhear them speaking in her native tongue. Like Sandra's parents, Jelka had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, and like Sandra and her mom, Jelka was at this open house pretending to be in the market for a home when really she was just fantasizing same as they were. So these commonalities they shared immediately put them all at ease, and before long, all three of them were chatting and laughing like they were old friends. Over the course of their 15 or so minute-long conversation, Jelka eventually asked Sandra pretty point blank if she was single or in a relationship. and Sandra, who was a little caught off guard by the abrupt question, said, "I'm single." At which point, Yelka lit up, and with a smile on her face, she said, "Well, I'd love for you to meet my son Joe. He's about your age and single too." Sandra smiled, but before she could respond, Yelka kind of waved her off like she knew she was being too pushy, and she just said, "Look, our family owns an automotive shop in town. It's called Sam & Sons. If either of you ever have car troubles, it's on the house. Bring your car in. And if you, Sandra, swing by, I'll introduce you to Joe." Then she handed Sandra a business card and said her goodbyes to both of them, and then turned and walked away. Once she was gone, Sandra and her mother kind of chuckled about the conversation they had just had, and then they went back to just enjoying the open house. And by that evening, when the mother and daughter had gotten back to their own home, they had more or less forgotten about Yelka. However, the following day, while Sandra was out running some errands, her car's engine started making really loud knocking sounds. While she didn't know what they meant, she knew that she really needed to have someone look at her car, and so as she began to look around, wondering if an auto body shop just happened to be close to her, she remembered Yelka from the day before giving her that business card for her auto body shop, and so Sandra pulled over to the side of the road, she fished inside of her purse, and she pulled out that card, the business card, and she saw the address of the auto body shop was only a couple of blocks away, and so she merged back onto the road and she began driving over. When she arrived outside of Sam & Sons auto body shop, she parked in their front lot, and then she got out and she made her way into the front office, and then as soon as she stepped inside, she saw right ahead of her was this big desk, and behind the desk was Yelka. And as soon as Yelka saw Sandra coming in, Yelka lit up and she said, "Oh my goodness, you're here, come here, come here. I gotta introduce you to my son." And that's when Sandra said, "Well, actually, I'm here because my car actually broke down today. And I was wondering if, you could have a look at it." And immediately Yelka said, "Oh, of course." She grabbed a mechanic, she pulled him over and said, "Right now, go out and get Sandra's car. She has to be at the front of the line." And so the mechanic went out to get Sandra's car, and then Sandra said, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to just go step outside and just let me know when it's done." But Yelka would say, No. You have to meet my son. Hold on just a minute." And so Sandra just kind of stood in the waiting room, kind of feeling a little bit awkward, and Yelka ran back into the back room behind the desk, and then she came running back out a few minutes later, and just a few seconds behind her was this handsome man in a crisp suit who had short dark hair and a perfectly manicured mustache, and Yelka immediately grabbed him and kind of wheeled him out from behind the desk and brought him right in front of Sandra, and with a huge grin on her face, she says to Sandra, "This is Joe, this is my son. He's single, you're single, you two should go on a date." And so Sandra and Joe immediately laughed because it was so pushy and so forward, it was just kind of comical. But over the course of their very short interaction, they both found each other attractive and they actually agreed to meet up for a date. And over the course of the next few weeks, the pair would go on many dates and they would become inseparable. Joe would take Sandra to the nicest restaurants in town, they would go dancing, and then sometimes they'd just hop on Joe's motorcycle and go for long rides in the countryside. Less than a month after their first meeting, Sandra was already telling her family and friends that Joe might be the one. And she would be right, because almost exactly a month after their first meeting, Joe would ask Sandra to marry him, and she would say yes. Sandra was beyond excited. She knew this proposal had been abrupt, but she didn't care. She felt like Joe was perfect. However, there was one detail about Joe that Sandra hadn't really seen fully yet, and that was his mother. Sandra was aware that Yelka could be a bit pushy. After all, she did literally tell Sandra to date her son while they stood directly in front of her son. However, after that interaction, Sandra had really not spent much time around Yelka and so hadn't formed much of an opinion of her. But as soon as wedding preparations began, that would change. Yelka wanted to plan every single detail of the wedding. You should get married in this church. You should buy this gown from the store. Your bridesmaids should wear these dresses. Here's a great music list for the wedding reception. Although she presented these as suggestions, they were more like demands. At first, Sandra tried to just roll with it and allowed Yelka to have her way with a number of the decisions, but after each concession, it just seemed like Yelka would come back with even more demands. Finally, Sandra had just had enough, and she told Yelka, "You gotta stop inserting yourself into every single wedding planning decision. This is my wedding. This is Joe's wedding, not yours." And shockingly, Yelka responded by effectively saying, "I know better than you, and I'm not going to stop telling you how to have the best wedding because I want it to be the best." Sandra was dumbfounded. She felt like she literally could not stop Yelka. And so she went to her fiance, and although she knew she was putting him in a really awkward situation, she told him he had to step in and tell his mom to back down, that she was totally overbearing and making this wedding process a nightmare. At first, Joe tried to act like Sandra was overreacting, but Sandra just was not having it, and she basically said, "I will postpone this wedding if you don't handle this." And so after a deep sigh, Joe told Sandra, "Okay, I'll go talk to my mom." And sure enough, Joe would. And Yelka would step back as a result of this conversation. However, it was plainly obvious that Yelka was not happy about this. And to show her displeasure, for the rest of the wedding planning cycle, Yelka refused to look at or talk to Sandra. But as upsetting as this was for Sandra, ultimately she was kind of okay with it because 1, Joe had demonstrated that he could have her back when she really needed him, and 2, she didn't really like talking to Yelka at this point. She found her incredibly annoying, and so to have Yelka ignoring her was kind of a good deal. A few weeks before their wedding, Sandra and Joe, who at that point both still lived with their parents, decided to go out and get an apartment they could share together as a couple. And they found one. It was very small and was the only one they could actually afford, but it was relatively close to both of their families and their work, so they took it. After getting the keys, Sandra and her mom would spend a very fun weekend going out to yard sales and discount stores to decorate and furnish the apartment, and by the time they were done, Sandra and Joe loved it. On June 11th, 1988, Sandra and Joe finally got married in front of all of their friends and family, and everyone seemed to have a great time, except for Yelka. Then, after the wedding, the new couple headed off to Hawaii for their honeymoon. A week later, Sandra and Joe returned to Vancouver, and when they walked into their new apartment, they were both shocked. The entire place had been completely redecorated. Couch covers had been switched out, the kitchen had been reorganized, bathrooms had different colored towels, the bed had different sheets on it, and it was even facing a different direction. After calling around to their families, they quickly discovered Yelka was responsible. She had used Joe's keys to slip into the apartment while they were on vacation. Sandra was furious. She and her mother had worked so hard to furnish and decorate the apartment to make it feel like her own, and now it just felt like Yelka's. It was so rude what she had done. Sandra literally couldn't believe it. Despite putting everything back the way it had been in their apartment, this was a massive violation of their privacy, and Sandra openly told Joe that she wanted nothing to do with his mother. However, it wasn't that simple for Joe. Despite her transgressions, Joe still loved his mom, and he got his paycheck from his mom. She was literally his boss at the auto body shop, so he couldn't just disown her, nor did he want to. This caused a lot of friction between the couple, but ultimately they just kind of accepted that they would need to find a way to live with Yelka and her intrusive behavior because she wasn't going anywhere. But despite Sandra's best efforts to put up with Yelka, Yelka made that nearly impossible on a regular basis. Shortly after the apartment redecorating incident, where afterwards Joe and Sandra told Yelka, "You cannot sneak into our apartment when we are gone," Yelka began sneaking into the couple's apartment when they were gone. Yelka had made a copy of her son's keys and just came and went as she pleased. At first, all she did was straighten things up around the apartment and periodically would go through their fridge, throwing away old food and sometimes replacing certain food items with other food items that she believed were better in some way. At first, Joe and Sandra actually didn't notice, but when it seemed like their entire fridge was starting to become full of food neither of them remembered purchasing, they confronted Yelka, and sure enough, she admitted to it. But the way she framed it was that she was simply swinging by and dropping off groceries. After this admission, privately, Sandra told Joe that he had to step in and stop Yelka from doing this. They had already told her, "You can't do this," and she's doing it all over again. And Joe, he would tell his wife, "Oh yeah, I'm going to tell her to stop, for sure." He actually would not. And so Yelka would just continue to come in and out of their apartment as she pleased. Sandra was furious and felt like she had totally lost control of the situation, but at the same time, she started having feelings that, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was wrong about Yelka, and she was just hypersensitive to what she was doing, and that in reality, Yelka was being really helpful. But when Yelka, during one of her secret apartment visits, removed half of Sandra's entire wardrobe from her closet and replaced it with clothing Yelka had bought, Sandra officially had had enough. Instead of waiting for Joe to come home that evening and to figure out what to do together, Sandra just hopped in her car and drove right over to her in-laws' house. When she arrived, she ran up the front steps. She didn't even knock on their door. She simply opened it and screamed at Yelka, who was straight ahead in the kitchen, that she can never come in their apartment without permission ever again. Then she screamed at Yelka to give her her clothing back immediately. Yelka seemed totally unfazed by this, and instead of saying sorry or trying to make an excuse, she just said very matter-of-factly, you don't look good in your clothing. I know what you look good in. Then she walked over to a closet near the front door, pulled out several dresses and blouses and kind of chucked them at Sandra, and then holding her crumpled clothes in her arms, Sandra glared at Yelka for an extra second before turning and storming out of the house back to her car. When she got back to her apartment, Joe had come home at this point, so Sandra walked in and pretty much immediately laid into him. She explained how his mom had taken her clothes and that now she had just completely had it. She was done with Yelka. She can't come back in here. It's over. It's done. But while the couple fought, there was a knock on their front door. The couple stopped talking and Joe stood up and walked over to the door and he opened it. And shockingly, standing on the other side was Yelka and her husband, Sam. Sandra saw them and literally ran over and slammed the door in their face. But through the now shut door, she heard Yelka call out, "Please let us in. I have something very important I want to tell you." Sandra could sense that Yelka's tone seemed different somehow. Perhaps she was here to apologize. It certainly seemed possible given recent events. And so while holding the doorknob, Sandra turned and looked at Joe, who had a look of I don't know what to do on his face. And then with a very frustrated sigh, Sandra turned the doorknob and opened the front door again, and immediately Yelka smiled at the couple and walked in like she owned the place. Sam followed behind her, but seemed wholly uninvested in whatever it was they were there for. Yelka strode right into the kitchen and she took a seat at the head of the table and then beckoned Sandra and Joe to come over and sit down as well. Sandra was already regretting her decision to let them in, but she did want to hear what Yelka had to say, and so she walked over and sat down, as did Joe. Once everyone was sitting around the table, Yelka smiled and said, "Sandra, Joe, we're going to make an $85,000 down payment on this beautiful 2-story house for you two to live in. We know this apartment is small and you want to start a family, and we want to give you the best home to do that in." Sandra and Joe were dumbstruck. They made very little money and had almost no savings, and so home ownership was not exactly on the horizon for them, although it was something they often fantasized about. But now, this fantasy could become a reality if they just said yes to Yelka. And so with Yelka sitting there staring at them intently with a big grin on her face, eagerly awaiting their answer, the couple exchanged a few quick glances at each other, kind of feeling each other out, and then they said, "Okay, yeah, thank you so much." Yelka was extremely pleased. She hugged them both and asked them to come by the property the next day to have a look around, and then Yelka and Sam got up and they left. That night, Sandra and Joe lay awake in bed talking about this incredible thing that had happened, and they came to the conclusion that Yelka must have been trying to make some sort of peace offering, that this was effectively a way for her to say sorry for what had transpired between them. And so by the time Sandra fell asleep that night, she was feeling very optimistic that her relationship with Yelka was about to improve. The following day, Sandra and Joe drove over to the house that they had just agreed to let Yelka and Sam put the down payment on, and right away, what stood out to Sandra was the home's proximity to Yelka's house. It was only about 5 minutes drive away, much closer than their current apartment was to Yelka's house. Also, as soon as Yelka arrived in her car and got out to talk to them on the sidewalk, she was absolutely brimming with excitement, talking about how she couldn't wait to start decorating the inside of the house. It was like she was moving into the house. Alarm bells were going off in Sandra's head. This arrangement clearly was a mistake. But at the same time, Sandra felt like they were in too deep. They had already agreed to do this. How could they possibly back out now? So against her better judgment, a few weeks later, the sale of this new house was finalized and Sandra and Joe moved in. But within a week of living there, everything fell apart. Sandra had mentioned to Joe that she wanted to put in a simple red accent tile along the back of the kitchen wall. Joe had apparently relayed this information to his mother, who promptly arrived at the house specifically to tell Sandra she wasn't allowed to do that Yelka already had plans for the kitchen. A massive fight broke out between the two women that ended with Sandra saying, "You know what? I'm done. I'm leaving. I'm moving in with my mom." Then Sandra did just that. She grabbed her things, put them in the car, and she left. Joe, who by now seemed to have just given up trying to keep the peace between his wife and his mother, didn't even try to stop her. It looked like Joe and Sandra's marriage was destined to fail. Yelka was just too much to overcome. But only a week after moving back in with her mother, Sandra started to feel nauseous. She took a pregnancy test and it revealed that she was pregnant. She was going to have Joe's baby. Sandra had a decision to make: return to Joe and by extension return to Yelka, or raise the child on her own. She called Joe to break the pregnancy news and talk about the way ahead for them, and he was extremely excited and begged her to come back and live in the house together again, and he promised he would keep his mother under control. By the end of the call, Sandra decided she was willing to go back and give it another shot, not because Joe was so convincing or that she thought Yelka was really going to change, but because she felt like she owed it to her unborn child. And much to Sandra's surprise, once she moved back into the house with Joe, it actually was much better than before. Namely because Yelka actually seemed to be giving them space. Clearly, Joe had laid down the law with her, and Yelka was respecting it. She gave them so much space that by the time Sandra actually gave birth to her son Brandon, she found herself secretly starting to kind of like Yelka, just a little bit. 6 months after Brandon was born, Sandra and Joe were both starting to feel very run down from being on baby duty 24/7, and so Joe suggested they go out on a date night that Friday. Sandra loved the idea and asked Joe to get them a babysitter, and then once he said he had, they made reservations for their favorite restaurant. When Friday came around, as Sandra was getting ready for the night, they heard the babysitter knock on the front door. Sandra opened the door and saw Yelka. Despite her recent good behavior, Sandra was still very much on edge, wondering when the old Yelka was going to come back out again. And so her immediate reaction to seeing Yelka on the other side of this door was, "What are you doing here?" Yelka looked at her funny and said, "I'm your babysitter. Joe asked me." Sandra immediately whipped her head around and looked at Joe, who was now standing very sheepishly in the middle of the room. Before Sandra could say anything to him, Yelka had slipped past her into the house and was already talking about how she and Brandon were going to have such a wonderful night together and that everything was going to be just fine. Sandra shut the door and then grabbed Joe and pulled him into another room and told him she didn't like this, that he should have told her he was going to have her babysit their son. But Joe told her she was overreacting, that, despite their past issues, his mom was really excellent with kids. This would be fine. Sandra did not like this, but eventually conceded. And then before the couple left, Sandra gave Yelka very specific instructions for how to care for Brandon, what to feed him, what time to put him to bed, etc. And the whole time, Yelka just reassured Sandra that it was going to be just fine. Just go out and have fun. Finally, after giving all the instructions she could possibly think of, Sandra and Joe said goodbye and they left. They went out to their favorite restaurant, and then afterwards they went to a club to go dancing. And as soon as they got there, Sandra stepped away and hopped on a payphone to call Yelka to make sure everything was going okay with their son. And when Yelka picked up, she informed Sandra that the boy was, quote, out like a light, because apparently she had given him some tea from the old country. Sandra said, "What? I told you he only takes breast milk. What did you give him?" And Yelka just laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. It's fine. He's asleep. Go enjoy yourself." Sandra was horrified. She hung up on Yelka and ran back into the club. She grabbed Joe and said, "Your mom just fed something to Brandon that she shouldn't have. We have to go." The two ran from the club. They hopped in the car, and then Sandra flew back to their house. As soon as they were parked outside, she ran up the steps into the house, right past Yelka, into her son's nursery, and then standing next to his crib, she reached down and she lifted him up, which should have woken him up, but it didn't. He just lay limp in her arms. And so immediately Sandra pressed his mouth up against her ear to see if he was still breathing, and barely she could tell he was still breathing. But despite screaming his name and moving him around, nothing was waking him up. And so by this point, Yelka had come into the room and she was trying to convince Sandra that this was no big deal, that, the tea from the old country works great. You got nothing to worry about. But at this point, Sandra is panicking and she's screaming at Yelka to tell her what was in the tea you gave him. But Yelka just wouldn't give her an answer. She just kept laughing and saying it was fine. And so finally, Sandra just takes her son and runs past Yelka, runs past Joe. She runs out to the car. She strapped her little boy into his car seat, and then she flew to the emergency room. And then when she got there, she hopped out. She's carrying her baby. She's hysterically crying. And she runs in through the doors, and all the doctors and nurses, they run over and they take the child from her, and they're asking all these questions. They're trying to figure out what's going on, and they start feeling for a pulse, and they would find one. However, it was very, very slow. And so they whisked Brandon away into an exam room to work on him and figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Sandra just had to pace in the waiting room, crying hysterically, having no idea what's happening to her boy. But luckily, just a few minutes later, one of the doctors would come back out of the exam room, and they would tell Sandra that, we think your son's going to be just fine. We don't know what he consumed, but whatever it was not good, and he should never have that again. And then he told Sandra she could come back and actually be with her son again. And so Sandra left the waiting room and she went down the hall. She went into the room where her son was. And there, laying on this bed with wires and tubes connected to him, is her little boy, who still looks totally lifeless. And so Sandra walked around and she sat down next to the bed and she laid her head down on the pillow and just looked at her son. And right there, in that moment, she decided that she was officially done with Yelka, even if it meant being done with Joe. A few minutes later, when Joe arrived by himself, Sandra would tell him he needed to choose. It was either going to be her or his mother. Unlike other times, Joe was not quick to come to his wife's side. In his mind, Sandra had become as much to blame for the drama as his mother was. And so after getting very frustrated with Sandra, he said, "You know what? You keep yelling at my mom, and I don't like it. She only wants to help and be supportive, and you just can't accept that. So I'm sorry, but I'm choosing my mom, not you." And Sandra would say, "Fine." And then the two of them just sat in silence on opposite sides of their son for the next hour until the doctors came back in and gave them the okay to take their son home, at which point Sandra immediately stood up and grabbed Brandon, and she and her son left the hospital without another word to Joe. She would drive her son to her mother's house and drop him off with her parents, and then she would go back to Joe's house, collect most of her things, and then move into her mom's house with her son. The following day, she would file for divorce. Immediately, the divorce became very nasty. Sandra didn't want Brandon anywhere near Yelka, so she decided to seek full custody of him. However, Joe, who by this point had gone from being something of an innocent bystander caught in the middle of two people he loved, to being aggressively on his mother's side, and therefore aggressively opposed to Sandra, told Sandra that he would be seeking full custody of Brandon as well. While these legal proceedings were going on, Joe's parents took it upon themselves to change all the locks of the house, knowing some of Sandra's things were still tucked away in the attic. Yelka also had their lawyer send Sandra a letter explaining that she was now forbidden from stepping foot inside of that house without express permission from Yelka. But as Joe and his mother made these punitive moves, Sandra would receive a huge legal break. The judge in their case had come to a decision. Sandra would get full custody of Brandon, and Joe would be required to pay child support and an alimony payment. The judge also ruled that Sandra would get primary ownership status of the house that Yelka had put the down payment on, and on top of all of that, based on Yelka's previous behavior, she was forbidden from having any contact with both Sandra and Brandon. Joe and his family were beyond outraged, but their only recourse was to be on their best behavior and try to file an appeal and have the judge change the ruling. So in the meantime, Joe very reluctantly and bitterly moved out of the house, and then Sandra and Brandon moved back in. Over the following few months, Joe didn't pay a dime of child support or alimony payments to Sandra. He also didn't bother to try to get in touch about seeing his son. Sandra was very upset about this. However, she was mostly just upset for her son, whose father basically had abandoned him. But as the silence between them grew, Sandra started to think to herself that maybe it was for the best. Fast forward about a year and a half to the summer of 1992, Joe was still not paying any support money to Sandra, and he and Sandra were still not talking, minus during court appearances for the appeals that had been filed. And during those short interactions, Joe would be openly cold and hateful toward his ex-wife, which Sandra could clearly tell made Yelka very happy. But Sandra didn't care. She had her son, she had the house, and she felt like no matter what they said or they did, they weren't going to stop her from trying to have the best life she could have. But Sandra's life was about to take a drastic an unexpected turn. In June of that year, Sandra walked out to her mailbox in the morning and found a small package with no return address on it. She brought the package inside, opened it up, and saw that it contained a paperback novel called The Deaths of Cindy James. It was a non-fiction account of a woman named Cindy James who for years had been harassed by some unknown person who ultimately killed her and got away with it. Sandra's first thought when she saw this book was that, maybe she had accidentally signed up for a book club or something. And so she just put the book on the table and went about her day. That evening, after work, she saw the book on the table and just picked it up and sat down and began flipping through the pages for the first time. And right away, she noticed someone had underlined several passages in the book. When Sandra began reading these highlighted sections in the book, she started to feel very uncomfortable. All the highlighted sections were descriptions of the specific awful things that had happened to Cindy. Namely, her tree in her front yard had been lit on fire. She started getting threatening phone calls at all hours of the night. Strangers would lurk on her property. Cars followed her around when she was out in town. And then the last underlined passage was about Cindy's death, and only 2 words were underlined: "You're dead." Sandra didn't know what to make of this book, but it definitely felt threatening. She assumed Joe had sent it just to be cruel. 2 days later, Sandra was sitting in her living room with a friend when they both suddenly heard a strange sound coming from the outside of the front of her house. All of the windows that looked into the front yard had the curtains drawn, and so Sandra and her friend stood up and walked over and pulled one of the curtains aside, and right in the middle of the front of her property on her front lawn, her tree was on fire, just like the Cindy James book. In fact, as soon as Sandra saw this, she handed Brandon to her friend and she ran into the kitchen and she grabbed the book, the Cindy James book, and she ran back and she flipped through the pages and she found the passage about the tree and she showed it to her friend and she said, "Look, someone sent me this 2 days ago and now they're doing what's happening in the book to me." Sandra would call the fire department and the police department and they would all show up and they would put the fire out. And then afterwards, Sandra would speak to the officers and she would explain the situation about her divorce and how she'd received this book. But the police didn't have much they could do. Even if Joe had done this, there was no proof. So they just told her to, be vigilant and report anything strange you see. And if you call us, we'll come out immediately. Over the following weeks, a man started calling Sandra's house in the middle of the night. He never said anything. He just breathed into the phone. The calls became so frequent that Sandra had to disconnect her phone at night just so she and Brandon could sleep. She would tell the police about the calls, but again, there was just nothing they could do. About a month after the calls had begun, Sandra was giving her son a bath in their house, and after he was all clean, she scooped him up in a towel and she carried him across the hall into his room, which was on the first floor in the back of the house. And when she walked into his room, the light was off, so it's totally dark, and the curtains that covered the back window were actually pulled to the side, revealing a clear view into the backyard. And standing right on the outside of her house, looking into her son's window, is this large man with a ski mask on. And he can clearly see that Sandra is looking at him, but he's totally unfazed. In fact, when he can tell that Sandra has made eye contact with him, he leans forward into the glass before turning and walking out of sight. Sandra immediately runs all over her house, making sure all the doors are locked, and then as she's reconnecting her phone to call 911, she hears banging on windows and she hears banging on the walls, and then by the time the police show up, there's no sign that anybody was there. And so once again, the police had to say to her, "Sorry, you're on your own." The next day, when Sandra noticed a car was now clearly following her in town, she realized all of the underlined sections of the Cindy James book had now happened to her in real life, except for one, the last underlined section, the one where Cindy dies. Scared for her life, Sandra hired a private investigator to both watch her home and try to figure out who was behind this. But after a couple of weeks, the nightly calls and occasional footsteps outside of her windows at night continued, and the private detective had gotten no closer to figuring out who was behind this. However, he did tell Sandra that he had been following Joe around and watching him and his family, and they all appeared to just be living a normal life. On the afternoon of August 5th of that year, so 2 months after receiving the Cindy James book in the mail, Sandra walked out of her dental office with her coworker Bernice. That day, Sandra was supposed to give Bernice a ride home. So the pair walked across the parking lot to the road where Sandra's car was parked. Sandra hopped in the driver's seat and fired up the engine, while Bernice hopped in the passenger seat and bent down to shove her bag underneath the seat below her. As Bernice was bent down, she suddenly heard gunfire on her left. She screamed and stayed bent forward, gripping the back of her head to protect herself, and then when the shooting stopped, Bernice sat up and looked out the front window, and she saw a red car speeding away from them. Then she turned to look at Sandra, and she saw her coworker was slumped forward. 2 of the 6 shots that had been fired from that red car had struck Sandra in the head. Bernice ran out of the car and she got help, and before long the police and paramedics were there, but by the time they reached Sandra, it was too late. She was already deceased. After her death, the police immediately turned their attention to Joe as their primary suspect. However, despite showing no emotion when he was told the mother of his child had just been murdered, he did have a rock-solid alibi. He had been at a public swimming pool during the shooting and even had a receipt to prove it. But the police just weren't buying it. Something seemed off about him. So they began staking out Joe's parents' house, which is where he was living at the time, watching to see what Joe did and who he talked to. And for the first 4 days, nothing unusual happened. But on the 5th day, the police were watching the house from a distance when Yelka suddenly came out the front door and hopped in her car and started to back down her driveway. But before she reached the end of the driveway, she came to a stop. Then a man came running out of her house who was neither Joe nor her husband, and he climbed into the back seat of her car and then laid down on the floorboards so no one could see him. The police thought this was very odd, so they decided to trail Yelka. They would follow her to a nearby mall parking garage where she and this man would climb out of the vehicle and go into the mall at different times as if they were trying to make it seem like they didn't know each other. One of the officers would stay in the parking garage watching Yelka's car, while the other officer went into the mall to see what these two were up to. But very quickly, that officer lost sight of both Yelka and this man, and so he had to return back to the parking garage with his partner. A little while later, the 2 officers watched as Yelka returned to her car, and then a few moments later, so too did this man, who promptly climbed back into her car and got down on the floorboards out of sight again. The police would trail Yelka back to her house, where as soon as she parked in the driveway, the man in the back climbed out and walked to the front of the property, hopped in a parked car, and drove off. The police followed this man and pulled him over less than a mile away, and when he got out of the car, something fell out of his pocket that blew the case wide open. It would turn out Joe really hadn't been involved in what happened to Sandra. However, his mother Yelka had. She had grown to hate Sandra so much she had decided she wanted to get rid of her, and she had just the plan in mind. Yelka was obsessed with the story of Cindy James, and so she decided she would force Sandra to relive Cindy's nightmare all the way to its grisly conclusion. After doing some digging, Yelka discovered one of her family friends, a man named Milan Nanatic, had connections to a hitman named David Segoviano. David was really just a seedy criminal willing to do just about anything for money. Yelka instantly told Milan to hire David to take out Sandra. However, she stressed that David had to first carry out all the underlined segments of the Cindy James book before he shot her down. Because Yelka didn't just want to kill Sandra, she wanted to torture her first. Milan Nanatic was the man who was hiding in Yelka's car. The two had driven to that mall so that Yelka could take $30,000 in cash out of a bank that she was paying to Milan for organizing the hit. And then Milan was going to take a portion of that and pay it to David, the shooter. And so when Milan got pulled over by police, when he stood up, the cash that he had been paid by Yelka was jammed in his pockets. And so literally he stood up and hundreds of dollars began falling out of his pockets. And very quickly the police were able to figure out what it was for. Less than a year later, Yelka, Milan, and David were tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Pesek. They were all given the maximum sentence for first-degree murder in Canada, which is 25 years. Joe Pesek was never charged with a crime. As for Sandra's son, he would go on to be raised by Sandra's mother.
Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Your support means a lot to us and helps us create more videos that you'll love. We appreciate your feedback and would love to hear your thoughts on the video. What did you like about it? What could we improve? Your feedback will help us create better content in the future. If you're interested in seeing more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. We post new videos every week, so you'll always have something new to watch. Once again, thank you for watching and supporting our channel. We hope to see you again soon. Smiling face.